The topic of chapter 46 is animal reproduction. There are many different ways for animals to reproduce. Shown here in this picture, we see coral spawning. They're doing what's called broadcast spawning, which means that they release these orbs, which you can see in this picture. These are released from certain of these corals, and there are male and female gametes within these orbs. And these will rise up to near the surface of the ocean, and the eggs and sperm will be released, and then they'll combine to form embryos. The embryos eventually will drift down and form new colonies of coral. So this is just one of many different ways that animals can reproduce, and we'll explore a number of different types of reproduction. Some organisms reproduce without any form of sex. Some organisms can change sex, and in some animals, including certain corals, individuals have both male and female organs. Sexual reproduction is the creation of offspring by fusion of haploid gametes, so male sperm and female eggs. And these haploid gametes, when they combine, shown here, during this process called fertilization, they then form a diploid zygote. And then from the zygote, you have continued growth through mitosis and development, and then you get to eventually the sexually mature individuals. So note that there is a difference between sperm and egg. Sperm tend to be small and they're motile, meaning they can move, whereas the female gamete, the eggs, tend to be large and non-motile. In addition to sexual reproduction, asexual reproduction is very common among animals. This is the creation of offspring without the fusion of an egg and sperm, and it's simply based on mitotic cell division. There are various forms of asexual reproduction. One form is called budding. Budding is a simple form of asexual reproduction found only among invertebrates. Individuals arise from outgrowths of existing ones. So for example, here a hydra reproduces by budding. This bud is a localized mass of mitotically dividing cells. In a previous slide, we saw that coral can reproduce sexually. They can also reproduce asexual, and one form of asexual reproduction is by budding. Through budding, new polyps bud off from their parent polyps, and these can form new colonies. Corals can also do something called fragmentation, in which a whole piece of the coral breaks off, perhaps during a storm, and then that piece of coral can then start to grow. Another form of asexual reproduction is called fission. Fission occurs when a parent organism separates into two or more individuals about the same size. So sea anemones are able to reproduce in this way. In this picture here, you can see that here's an anemone pre-fission. The anemone begins to elongate. The petal disc at the base of its body stretches into an hourglass shape, and the animal tissue begins to separate at the narrowest point down the center. The separation moves from the base of the anemone's body, you can see it beginning here, upwards towards the oral disc, which is here. The last part of the body to separate is the sphincter muscle that surrounds the oral disc, which you can see here. After the animal has divided into two halves, each one folds in on itself with the open edges fusing together. So you can see there are open edges here that now fuse together. And additionally, the animal is able to regenerate any missing or damaged internal structures. Another form of asexual reproduction is called fragmentation. I already mentioned fragmentation earlier in the context of a piece of coral breaking off during a storm. That piece can then begin to reproduce asexually, and so there will be more and more coral polyps. There are a number of different other animals that can do fragmentation. So for example, a flatworm or planarian can be cut into pieces, and each piece can then become a new individual animal. Hydra can also be cut in half, generating new individual animals. And starfish can also do this. So for example, when a starfish loses an arm, it's possible for the arm to develop into an entirely new organism. So fragmentation must be accompanied by regeneration and regrowth of the lost body parts. In addition to these animals, annelid worms, certain annelid worms are able to also reproduce by fragmentation. In the forms of asexual reproduction we've discussed so far, the new individuals arose from mitosis. There's yet another form of asexual reproduction called parthenogenesis, in which the development of the new individual is from an unfertilized egg. So this would be a haploid egg. Parthenogenesis is mainly observed in invertebrates, but is rarely observed, but is occasionally observed in vertebrates, and we'll discuss those cases in a second. In honeybees, the drones, the males' genes are derived entirely from their mother, the queen. They arise by parthenogenesis. So the males, in fact, have half the number of genes as the mother, because the mother is diploid and the drone is haploid. And then when the drone produces sperm cells, these will contain their entire genome. So they'll have exactly the same genes as the drone. So all the sperm are genetically identical, except for perhaps some mutations from one sperm to the next. So again, the male's bees' genetic makeup is therefore entirely derived from the mother. Now, it's a bit different for the worker bees, which are all females. They are diploid, and they have the full complement of genes. Half are derived from a mother, and the other half from the father, which would have been a drone. There are, in fact, well-documented cases of vertebrate parthenogenesis. Typically what happens is they'll have a female of a certain species in a zoo isolated from a male. So there's no way there could have been any sort of insemination. And then the female will, after years, give birth to a new individual. So this has happened with Komodo dragons. So we know that Komodo dragons are able to do parthenogenesis. This has also happened with certain species of sharks. So for example, hammerhead sharks have been known to do this in captivity, and therefore we know they can do parthenogenesis. Now the idea is that, why would this exist? Well, the idea is that this may serve a function. If a female is not able to find a mate, then rather than not give birth at all, it's probably good to go ahead and give birth parthenogenically. Now, studies have also shown that parthenogenesis definitely occurs in the wild. For example, female sawfish in the wild have been shown to be genetically identical, and this is a very good indicator that they arose by parthenogenesis. For many sexually reproducing animals, finding a partner for reproduction can be challenging. This refers specifically to animals that are not very mobile, or maybe they live very separated from other animals of the same species. So, a chance encounter with another of the same species is rare. And so if you had males and females, then there's a good chance, about 50% of the time, instead of a male and a female meeting, it would be a male and a male, or a female and a female. So in order to increase the odds of being able to reproduce, these animals are hermaphrodites. So they have both male and female reproductive systems. So then as long as they meet another of the same species, they can immediately reproduce if they so choose to. So any two individuals can mate under this system, so that's very convenient. So shown here, you can see a picture here of sea slugs called nudibranchs, and these are hermaphrodites. So they're engaged in sexual reproduction in this picture here. We've also spoken about corals. They reproduce asexually and also sexually. Now, it turns out among different coral species, there are some corals in which when you see an entire colony, all the polyps of the colony will generate male gametes. In other words, they'll generate sperm, or another colony might generate nothing but female gametes or eggs. But there are some species, such as star corals and the brain coral, which is shown here, and they are in fact able to generate both sperm and eggs. So this actually allows for the possibility, although it's not the most common thing, some hermaphrodites would in fact be able to self-fertilize. So in other words, if this brain coral would release sperm and eggs at the same time, they would in fact have the possibility of self-fertilizing and generating new colonies of brain coral. Among animals that sexually reproduce, there are several organisms that can change their sex under certain circumstances. So this is actually fairly well known that certain species of fish can do this. And one of the most well-studied fish that can do this is the bluehead wrasse. And these live in harems. So essentially they'll have a group of females. You can see here females pictured. They're yellow in color. Sometimes they have a little bit of brown also in their coloration. The blue headed wrasse gets its name from the blue head of the male, which is quite striking. Occasionally they'll have more of a greenish tinge. So basically you'll have a single male that produces sperm, and this would be able to fertilize the eggs that are produced by this harem of females. Now occasionally what will happen in nature is the male will die. And in that case what will happen is the largest female will then transform into a male. And in a scientific study, they found that this process only takes about 20 days. What they did is this was a study done in Key Largo, Florida. They would remove a male from a group, and then they'd look at the females over time and see what was happening physiologically to them. And they found that this largest female, within just about 8 to 10 days, the ovaries would shrink and would be replaced by sperm-producing tissues. And in about 8 to 10 days, the ovaries were transformed completely into testes, and the fish could then mate with females at that point. And to get the full coloration change, that process takes about 20 days. So the bluehead wrasse is one of the fastest of these different fish that are able to change sex. And there are a number of other species that can do this also. For example, there's a type of shrimp that starts out as a male, but it can turn into a hermaphrodite if need be. For most animals, reproduction only occurs at certain times of the year. In other words, their reproductive cycles are regulated by changing seasons. Their bodies will pay attention to things like changes in day length as well as temperature. So these reproductive cycles are controlled by hormones and, as I said, environmental cues such as day length and temperature. Ovulation is the release of mature eggs at the midpoint in a female cycle. So we could take the example of songbirds. They return from the south, they come back to the north, and they'll arrive at the breeding grounds in the spring, and that's when the females are then become sexually receptive. And you can see here some courtship behavior in spring. The male is giving food to the female, which is part of the courtship behavior in the species. For other species, the period of gestation, meaning the time of development of the embryo and fetus, is longer. And so the reproductive cycle is correspondingly offset in time. So for example, for sheep, the female shaper ewe, the reproductive cycles occur only in the fall and early winter. This is because it takes about 5 months for the full gestation of a baby lamb. And so these females are sexually receptive in the fall and winter. They become impregnated, and then the baby ewe is developing in the womb throughout winter. And then by early spring, the ewe is then born. And this is obviously the best times. They have the highest chance of survival because the temperature is mild and there's plenty of food available for them. So it turns out that you can have sexual behavior in an asexual animal. This sounds crazy, but it does happen. There are asexual whiptail lizards that are descended from a sexual species, and the females still exhibit mating behavior. We know that the reproduction is strictly asexual. There are no males in the species, yet the females engage in courtship behavior, which you can see here. There's essentially one female on top of another one. And the one on top is mimicking the behavior of the male. The one on the bottom is acting as a normal female would in a sexual species. And it turns out these females will alternate roles two to three times during the breeding seasons. To understand this phenomenon better, scientists looked at the levels of sexual hormones within the species of asexual lizard. They found that when the level of estradiol, which is the main estrogen hormone, estrogen, recall, is a number of different hormones that are related to female reproduction and development. Estradiol is the main estrogen hormone. When this level is high, the individual adopts female behavior. Let's take a look at this picture. So here we're tracking over time the hormone level of estradiol. And you can see as the estradiol level goes up, there's also an increase in ovary size. Here it goes down, here it comes back up again, the ovary size goes up. And we're tracking in this picture the hormone levels within the brown female here. So you can see when the estradiol levels are high, the animal acts like a female, okay? In contrast, when the level of progesterone is high, the individual adopts male behavior. So here we're tracking progesterone in the same individual, the brown individual shown here. Right after ovulation, the level of progesterone goes up, and notice that the animal has now switched over to doing the male behavior, and her ovaries are very shrunken now at this point. Now the progesterone eventually goes down, the estradiol level comes up, and this individual switches back to acting like a female. After ovulation, her estradiol level drops very precipitously, and her progesterone level goes up, and she switches back to acting like a male. So the individual is more likely, and the reason for this is, I mean, the male is obviously not a real male. It's just it's a female mimicking male-like behavior. There's no transfer of anything. But the thing is, the female is acting like a male, and so she's stimulating the other female in ways that would make the female that's acting like a female more likely to ovulate. So this behavior, this courtship behavior, serves as a trigger for the ovulation. The individual is more likely to ovulate if she's mounted at the critical time of the hormone cycle. And so this gives us some clue as to what happened in the past. These parthenogenic lizards, which are all female, likely evolved from a species that had two sexes. And this sexual behavior is a holdover from that time. And it's still possible for these animals to go ahead and reproduce without mimicking the sexual behavior, but they're more likely to ovulate. So that's why they continue to do this. When we look at large multicellular organisms, they generally do sexual reproduction. Some of them also do asexual reproduction. Some will do both asexual and sexual. And so it's been a little bit of a mystery or an evolutionary enigma how exactly sexual reproduction has been able to continue. And we'll go through some of the disadvantages of sexual reproduction, and then we'll circle back around and talk about some possible advantages of sexual reproduction. The disadvantages of sexual reproduction are very clear. Let's take sort of a little of a model situation where we just sort of assume that each female has two offspring. So we have a female, it's going to make two offspring. The one female reproduces, one of the females is going to reproduce asexually, and we'll compare that to another one that reproduces sexually. So after a number of generations, which will have more offspring? You can probably guess already what will happen. Okay, so in the second generation, there wasn't really any difference, right? The female created two offspring, which we said was part of the sort of game that we're doing. And so the one that reproduced asexually will have two females, and the one that reproduced sexually will have a female and a male. And again, we're just assuming this is sort of just a model. So we're saying it'll be exactly half and half. So there'll be one female and one male. Now, by the third generation, though, there's a difference that starts to arise, which is the female gave rise to females. Each female can give rise to two more females. So now you have four individuals. For the sexual reproduction, though, you'll see that only the female is able to give rise to any offspring, because obviously males, if you didn't notice, they can't reproduce. They can't actually directly generate offspring. They need the help of a female. And so males, in a sense, are kind of useless in that sense. They're not actually contributing much. And so you can see sexual reproduction is already losing out very clearly to asexual reproduction. By the third generation, we have a ratio of 2 to 1. By the fourth ratio, there are now 8 individual offspring from that first female that was reproducing sexually. And there are only 2 individuals from the female that was reproducing sexually. And therefore, we have a ratio of 4 to 1. And of course, this we could go on, but this we can end here. You can see that this is going to get exponentially worse and worse. And so the asexually reproducing female will, very by a large margin outstrip the one female that started to reproduce sexually. So this is very interesting. It brings up the question of why exactly this would occur. There's a clear disadvantage with sexual reproduction, which is that you produce all these males. They don't directly produce any individuals for the next generation. So what exactly do males contribute? I should point out that in addition to this clear difference in the number of offspring that are generated after a few generations, there's also a little more subtle of an effect, but it's also an important one. From an evolutionary point of view, genes would like to pass themselves on. And so sometimes this is referred to as the selfish gene. It's really not about individuals. It's more about the genes being passed from one generation to the next. If you look at asexual reproduction, you'll see that the female, who's 100% of her genes are passed on to the next generation through asexual reproduction. Now, there may be some mutations and things like that occur, but in general, one of her daughters, even a number of generations down the line, would be almost genetically identical to the original female. I mean, again, there are some spontaneous mutations that arise, but those don't occur that frequently. Now let's look at the female who is reproducing sexually. Well, she's combining her genes with a male who's not shown here. So she's actually only passing on half her genes to any individual, okay? And so there's also a penalty in terms of, if you look at this from a gene-centric point of view, with asexual reproduction, you get to pass on all your genes. With sexual reproduction, you only pass on half your genes to a given individual. So, for example, if you wanted to pass on the same total number of genes, this female here doing sexual reproduction would have to have 4 offspring to balance the amount of genes that are passed on to just 2 offspring with asexual reproduction. So far, I've outlined 2 major disadvantages of sexual reproduction. One is that you spend a lot of energy producing males who don't directly produce offspring. And the second thing is that if you look at this from a gene-centric point of view, you're diluting the genes and not passing as many genes on from one individual to the next generation. So from a gene-centric point of view, it's not as advantageous. But despite these disadvantages, sexual reproduction is very prevalent in many, many species. Even in species that are capable of asexual reproduction, they usually often will keep sexual reproduction also. So during part of a season or something like that, they may switch from asexual back to, say, sexual reproduction. So what advantage does sexual reproduction provide that offsets its enormous cost? Well, so sexual reproduction may enhance reproductive success when environmental factors change relatively rapidly. And the reason for this may be due to the production of genetically varied offspring. So if you think about it this way, when you have the sexual reproduction, you're essentially mixing genes from 2 individuals. And so some of those genes, particularly in new combinations, may suddenly give rise to an animal that's particularly fit for a particular environment. And by environmental factors, we're considering things like temperature, salinity of the ocean, things like that, like things you would typically think of. But also, there's a big component of that are things like parasites, bacteria, things that would attack an animal. If animals are all genetically identical, well, then they're really susceptible to being attacked by a given parasite or a given virus or a given bacteria. Whereas if they're genetically different or heterogeneous, then they have more chance that some of the individuals would be particularly fit for that given environment and be able to have great reproductive success. So It's actually been shown that asexual reproduction is quite advantageous in stable, favorable environments when you're not under attack of so many different, say, parasites and things like that, when food is available and things like that, and so in those sorts of situations, you would predict that maybe sexual reproduction would start to die out. But in fact, there are enough situations in which the world is not so predictable, and so that there is really a huge benefit to having individuals that are genetically varied. Fertilization is the union of an egg and sperm, and fertilization may occur external or internal to the body of the animal. In external fertilization, eggs are shed by a female and then are fertilized by sperm in the external environment. So external fertilization may happen in a moist or wet environment, which allows for the sperm to swim to the egg, and the gametes don't dry out immediately. So, for example, we all know that frogs do this. In this picture here, for example, we have a male clasping a female, and this stimulates her to release her eggs, and she's done that. So these are the eggs. Now you can't see the sperm because they're so much smaller, but he's presumably also released his sperm, and those will externally fertilize these eggs. So one of the key things about fertilization is you have to bring the egg and the sperm together, and so this is done here in this pond through this courtship behavior, and finally that culminating the male clasping the female. Now, in other species, it may be more difficult. These are modal or mobile species. The frog, they can get together and have a courtship ritual and so forth. The other species of sessile animals, ones that don't move, they'll have to find other unique ways, or animals that simply don't encounter each other very easily. They have to find unique ways of bringing the sperm and egg together, and we'll look at some examples of that. Some species with external fertilization exhibit a behavior called spawning, in which individuals cluster in the same area to release their gametes into the water at the same time. In some cases, chemical signals may trigger spawning, and others, environmental cues are responsible. We're going to look at one specific example, which is the Palolo worm. This is found in parts of the South Pacific Ocean. So what these worms do is they live burrowed in the coral, and so they don't actually get to see other Palolo worms very often as they're sort of burrowed underground and so forth. Now, what they do is they generate what's called an epitoke. So here's the worm. Here's the head of the worm with eyes and so forth, and sense organs. So that's the body proper, and then the end of the animal here, when it's getting ready to reproduce, are essentially segments that are filled with nothing but either sperm for a male, or females would have eggs. And so you can see a close-up of these little segments. So for example, the green ones here are female. They're going to have nothing but eggs, and the white ones are male. They're going to have nothing but sperm. And so it has this long chain of these things. And at a certain point in time during the season, breeding season, and this is going to be correlated with a particular phase of the moon, the worm breaks off this epitoke. So this breaks off, and this has all the reproductive cells. And the epitoke itself can swim. It has photoreceptors. They have photoreceptors, and so they can judge, which is up. And so they'll swim up towards moonlight, and they'll swim to the surface. Now, once they get to the surface, they'll start to burst open. There's different ways for these the eggs and the sperm to get out. Sometimes there are little pores for them to get out. Other times they burst open. But then there'll be eggs and sperm in sort of a milky mucus at the surface of the ocean. And these eggs and sperm get together and form a zygote, and then you have essentially a baby worm at that point. So anyway, this is the whole situation is called spawning, in which they wait for a certain cue. In this case, it's a certain timing cue based on the moon. And you get this great congregation of male and female tail segments that release these sperm and eggs into the water. And it turns out that this attracts fish that go absolutely nuts. These as you can imagine, sperm and eggs, they're very energy dense. And so these are absolutely delicious for fish. So there'll be swarming fish. And at the same time, in the South Pacific, in many cultures, from Vietnam to Japan to the Samoans, they find that these epitopes, tokes, are very delicious, and they'll have found various ways of eating them as boiled, fried, or raw, mixing them with coconut milk and onions and so forth. And so there's not only the fish, but also humans out there, and they'll shine lights on these epitopes, and this, because they have the photoreceptor, they're drawn towards the flashlights, and then people will catch them with their nets. So we've seen that external fertilization is relatively common in animals that live in an aqueous environment, be it the ocean or a lake or a river. External fertilization is not as well adapted for life on land. So you'll find that many animals that have are adapted to living on land, 99% of the time, they'll have developed a fertilization scheme called internal fertilization. This allows the sperm to reach the egg despite a dry external environment. Internal fertilization requires behavioral interactions and compatible copulatory organs. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Another thing that's quite interesting is mating animals may use pheromones, which are chemicals released by one organism that influence the physiology and behavior of individuals of the same species. And one of the classic examples of this is the pheromones that are released by the female moth that attract the male moth during the night. So here's a female moth. Here she is. She's releasing pheromone. She's at this red dot, and there's a plume of pheromone. And what the male does is it will follow this plume. So it's looking at this concentration of pheromones as it gets closer and closer to the female, it becomes more concentrated. And it does essentially two different behaviors. One is to surge, which is essentially to surge ahead quickly as it moves up this concentration gradient. But then what will happen, actually, this is real data. You can see once it loses the scent it goes out of the plume, it will do casting, where it sort of casts back and forth until it finds the plume again. And then it'll surge ahead again, so going up the concentration gradient. And here at the very end, this male got a little confused. It had to cast a lot. And then eventually it did find the female. So we saw with the example of the Palolo worm that with external fertilization, it's basically kind of like a lottery. You generate tremendous numbers of sperm and eggs, and you release them, and you hope that just even a few of them will be able to get together and form zygotes. And then the baby worms, of course, are very vulnerable because there's no parental involvement. They're on their own to survive, and then fall to the bottom of the ocean and start to dig their own burrow when they're a bit older. Internal fertilization is typically associated with the opposite. So there's many fewer gametes that are produced, and also there's a higher survival fraction of the zygotes. So for example, in humans, we have internal fertilization. You can see here the fertilization occurs in the fallopian tube. So the ovaries, which are the gonads in the human female, generate the eggs. The eggs travel along the fallopian tube. So for example, here, this one's active. It's moving along this way. Sperm can enter into the uterus. The uterus actually does some contractions that help to move the sperm along. The sperm, of course, are motile themselves. They can move. And then they continue to swim up. And they'll usually meet somewhere in the fallopian tube. And that's where fertilization occurs. So that's an example of internal fertilization. As I said, there's going to be far fewer gametes produced, and then there's usually a higher fraction of the zygotes that are then able to survive. So, of course, this fertilized egg is considered a zygote. It's diploid, right? It has the full complement of chromosomes. And we're going to look at, in subsequent slides, we'll look at the fact that with internal fertilization, it's often associated with mechanisms to provide protection of embryos, such as the shell of an egg for a bird or reptile, and also parental care. So with animals that live on land, there's generally a bigger investment with each fertilized egg. So internally fertilized eggs of birds and reptiles have shells and internal membranes. So you don't have to memorize all these layers or anything, but the main point is you can see that there's a shell, there's internal membranes, there's a yolk, and so forth. So it's very complicated. And the reason for this is this has to protect the fertilized egg or zygote from dehydration, and has to be mechanically protective against being crushed and things like that, because it's not in an aqueous environment. In contrast, the eggs of fishes and amphibians only have a gelatinous coat, and they lack these internal membranes. So they're generally much simpler eggs. And rather than producing just a few eggs, for example, a zebrafish would generate a few hundred, maybe 300 eggs at a time. So again, there's more investment per individual zygote for animals on land. Additionally, animals that do internal fertilization generally are more likely to give parental care. And so parental care, of course, helps ensure the survival of offspring. And our example of parental care is kind of a cute one. This is a giant water bug. These produce relatively few offspring, but offer much greater parental protection. So following internal fertilization, the female glues her fertilized egg to the back of a male. So here's a male giant water bug carrying the eggs. And so the male will take really good care of these eggs. It will ventilate the eggs, making sure that they have enough oxygen. It'll make sure that parasites don't hack the eggs, and so forth. So it's a degree of parental care you don't generally see in a lot of invertebrates. So a very nice example. So continue with the theme of protection of embryos and fetuses. Some animals retain the embryo within the female's reproductive tract. So for example, in marsupial animals, the fetus spends a short amount of time in the uterus developing. It will then leave the uterus by crawling out, and then it completes this development attached to the mammary gland in the mother's pouch. So for example, here we can see a fetal wallaby crawling to the pouch. So you can see that the animal's not very well developed. It's developed well enough to be able to crawl. You can see it must have some fairly well developed musculature, but you see it has no ears, no eyes. Seems like quite a perilous journey, but once it makes it to the pouch, it then continues development. And here you can see a wallaby joey in its mother's pouch. Protection of the embryo and developing fetus is taken to an extreme in eutherian or placental mammals, such as sheep and humans. The embryo in these animals remains in the uterus throughout the entire fetal development. The embryo is nourished by the mother through the placenta. Embryos of some fish and sharks also complete development internally. For example, here's a picture of a shark giving birth. So this is found in certain types of sharks, such as bull sharks, lemon sharks, mako sharks, and so forth. To reproduce sexually, animals must produce gametes from precursor cells. These precursor cells are established early in the formation of an embryo, and then they remain inactive for a period of time. Later, there'll be mitotic division of these precursor cells, so that we'll have an increased number of precursor cells, which are then useful for making sperm and eggs later in life. In most species, individuals have gonads. These are specific organs that produce gametes. So for example, in humans, the male gonad is the testes, and the female gonad is the ovary. Some organisms reproduce sexually and you have no gonads. The gametes form from undifferentiated tissue. An example of this is the Palola worm. In this worm, the egg and sperm develop from undifferentiated cells that line the coelom, the body cavity. As the gametes mature, they're released from the body wall and fill the coelom. Many organisms have reproductive systems that are relatively elaborate. These would include sets of accessory tubes and glands that carry and nourish and protect the gametes in developing embryos. For example, in the female fruit fly, there are spermathecae, which are here. Here's a spermatheca, so singular spermatheca. These are sacs that store and keep sperm alive for an extended period of time. So the idea is that the female, when the conditions are right, will choose the time of fertilization. She will generate eggs when the conditions are right in terms of, say, nourishment and so forth for the developing eggs. She'll generate the egg. The egg, as it passes through the oviduct and into the uterus, it's then fertilized by the sperm from the spermathecae, and then the egg will go through the uterus and finally exit through the vulva. So this allows the female fruit fly to have really good control over when she lays eggs. So again, she would do this only when times are optimal for the offspring to have food. There are some interesting variations in vertebrate reproductive systems. In many non-mammalian vertebrates, the digestive, excretory, and reproductive systems have a common opening to the outside called the cloaca. So for example, in many bird species, they have a cloaca rather than a penis. For the male, so for example, here is a male on top of a female, and you can see that this is a male because it has testicles here, and the spermatic duct. And so it's going to be able to release the sperm into the cloaca of the female, and you can see this is a female because there's the oviduct and the ovary. In contrast to this, there are a few birds, such as ducks, that do have penises. So penises do exist developmentally in many bird species, but they have opted for this cloaca rather than a penis. Mammals usually have a separate opening for the digestive tract and the reproductive system. So males and females of many species have evolved mechanisms to decrease the chance of their mating with another individuals. So for example, a male insect may transfer secretions that make the female less receptive to courtship. Female fruit flies have the ability to eject sperm from their spermathecae. So in other words, a female fruit fly may mate with a male fruit fly, and she'll store some sperm in the spermathecae. But let's say she has a chance to mate later with another male. She may eject that sperm and then fill her spermathecae with sperm from the next mating. And it's not 100% clear why they do this, but perhaps the idea is fresher sperm would lead to more viable embryos. So this is data from an experiment. What they did was they took females and they allowed them to mate with various males. So in the control situation, what we're plotting here on the y-axis is the number of females lacking sperm in the spermathecae. So, for example, if a female mates once, then most of them will have sperm in the spermathecae. So just a small percent, say 5%, don't have any. Now, if you allow this female to remate with another wild-type male, then it'll be even lower percentage. So, but we don't know which sperm is filling the spermathecae at this point, right? It could be the first one or it could be the second males. So they did an experiment where they in the second mating. So the first mating was the wild-type male, so a male that has sperm. Then they remated the same female a second time with a male that has no sperm. And then they looked in the spermathecae and they found that there's actually a much higher percentage of females now lacking sperm in the spermathecae. And so the idea is, we don't know exactly the mechanism how they do this, but it appears that they probably ejected some of the sperm from the first mating in order to make room for sperm for the second mating. But this second male didn't have any sperm, and therefore now there's a much higher percentage of the females that are lacking sperm in the spermathecae. And you get very similar results with when the second mating was with a male that goes through all the steps of copulation, but doesn't actually ejaculate. And so again, there's a high percentage of females that are lacking sperm in the spermathecae. So this indicates that it appears that she's somehow ejected the sperm from the first mating in order to make room for sperm for the second mating. But in this case, there was no sperm because there was no ejaculate. And so this gives you an idea that there is, in fact, a degree of controls. The female fruit fly is able to control the sperm and the spermathecae. And again, we don't know 100% the reason for why she would get rid of one set of sperm in favor of the second sperm from the second copulation. But the idea is perhaps the second one would be fresher sperm. We're going to end this lecture just touching very briefly on patterns of mating. So monogamy is relatively rare among animals, including mammals. So the more common mating pattern is polygamy. So why do certain animals practice monogamy? Well, there's a couple of theories for this. One is that monogamy may provide more effective parental care for infants, such as in birds. So for birds, as you can imagine, they have a fairly compressed reproductive cycle that has to occur in one summer. Courtship occurs in spring, say for songbirds, and then they would build a nest, and they would then the female has to lay the eggs, and then the baby birds have to go very quickly in terms of development. And so they're going to grow very quickly, and they need a tremendous amount of food. So it takes two parents essentially to bring them enough food, and also to protect the eggs, which are very vulnerable from predators. And a similar theory applies to primates as well as humans, which is that primates and humans are generally pretty vulnerable early on. And so there's a relatively long period of time in which there needs to be parental investment in terms of bringing them food, protecting them, sheltering them, and so forth, and teaching them also. So particularly for human infants, there's a long period of development of the brain that doesn't exist in other animals. So parental care is one of the major theories. Another theory is that among primates, monogamy may have evolved because it protects infants from being killed by rival males. This is called infanticide. So a typical scenario would be that if you didn't have monogamy, a male may, participate in the generation of a baby, and yet if the male leaves, then that young primate might be killed by a rival male. And so it actually is advantageous for both the male and the female for the male to stick around to protect the young, very vulnerable infant primate. And so, of course, it's always dangerous to apply these things to humans, but there's certainly a lot of interesting studies on primates, and we are primates, so perhaps some of these same rules apply to humans. And there are more theories. I've only presented two of the most perhaps commonly espoused theories, but there are other theories for why monogamy may exist. And so we'll end there.